name. Is that SHOU? I can't read that name quite, but it's a good morning to you all. Albert Morgan, Wilbert Davis, good to see you all this morning. I trust everyone is doing well. We had the big news coming out of the parliament yesterday, the estimates of expenditure, $1.4 trillion to be spent or planned to be spent in the upcoming fiscal year by the government. A good portion of that going towards the continued reconstruction and recovery from Hurricane Melissa. And that, listeners, is where I'd like to go this morning now that we have the figures in. But what I note of interest is for the first time in, I think, 10 years to be exact, the interest is not so much on the line items of the budget, but rather the new tax measures outlined by the Holness administration as a means to plug some of those gaps created by Hurricane Melissa. I think it's about, in this fiscal year, that's an additional $29 billion to be added on in the next fiscal year, about $15 billion in terms of the necessities for government tax revenues. And I have an assessment of some of those measures, just something I quickly put together as in my own understanding of it. And the first one, I think, is the trickiest one, because I think a lot of Jamaicans not quite sure what to make of this one, and that's the proposed extension of GCT to what the government has defined as digital services and intangibles. We just have to wait to see what this specifically means. I hope that the finance minister, either during the budget debates or even before, can provide some clarity as to what is strictly defined as a digital service and how the government intends to collect this tax. I, like many Jamaicans in the modern age, use numerous digital services, and I'm rather curious as to what the government's approach will be. So for this one, I am simply going to say to be decided. The next matter is that of the special consumption tax on sweetened beverages. This one requires some deep analysis. I mean, firstly, it's one of the measures intended to bring in the most revenue for the government. That's about $10 billion in additional revenue. Secondly, it's one that may have the widest societal impact, not only in terms of whom it impacts, but its potential to modify behavior. The two issues are very closely intertwined. If the measure was truly meant as a modifier to behavior, then the government could not realistically expect to collect the over $10 billion in additional revenue the line item is projected to generate. The SET is also applied either at point of entry in the country or directly borne by the manufacturer here if it's a local good. Inevitably, this cost will likely be passed on to consumers, but it's further unlikely that the impact on price will truly make any adjustments in terms of consumption patterns. What's of even more interest to me is to what extent does the average Jamaican pay attention to what's considered a sweetened beverage. For example, if you look at the back of a True Juice box, you will see that there is a sugary component, though if you don't pay much attention, you'll think, oh, this is just natural juice. So I think a lot of Jamaicans are going to have to now pay attention to what they're actually consuming to say, oh, am I paying additional for this because it's sweetened, etc., etc. So my assessment for this measure is a simple one. Just drink water. I don't think it really gets more complicated than that. I think at this point, water is still cheaper than most sweetened beverages anyway, so just drink water. And next is the further expansion of sin taxes tied to alcohol and cigarette consumption. And I think for the most part, this one doesn't really require that much analysis. I think many Jamaicans accept that neither of these habits can be considered essential, nor can the government expect any true adjustment in their consumption through additional taxation. So I think this one is just neither here nor there. It's almost an easy call by the government to say, let's just simply increase the taxes on cigarette and alcohol. I know the Ray and Nephews and the other manufacturers of these goods tend to be concerned about that, because there is the issue of raising the taxes on the legitimate sources of these things, such as I said, the manufacturers, and then you have the illicit trade that goes essentially under the radar, where you can get things like the alcohol and the cigarette far cheaper when they simply do not have to pay the taxes on them. So I hope the government, in pursuing this measure, remembers that we still do have local manufacturers of these goods that do require some level of protection, and that they crack down on the illicit trade of cigarettes and alcohol. Well, the next one on the line item, modification of the 20% duty concession on motor vehicles for public officials. I'm not going to say too much on this, just to say, just like every other Jamaican, the public sector must make the sacrifice as well. We're going through a difficult time, and it cannot be borne by just the average Jamaican. It has to be borne by everyone across every sector. And I think this is just a good idea on the whole. The duty concession is not going away, despite I think even the IMF suggesting that it should, but it's not going away. But it should be modified in a way so that even the public sector must see that they have to make the sacrifices as well. The environmental protection levy rate being increased to 0.8% from 0.5%. This one is intended to bring in some decent amount of revenue, about $6 billion over the next 2 financial years. But I think we need to bring in an expert, probably somebody from JET, to really analyze this as to what impact this could have on the overall environment and the practices in terms of ensuring that that is not degraded. But next of interest, the increase in general consumption tax on tourism activities. Now it moves from the 10% concessionary rate to the 15% GCT rate. What should be noted, though, listeners, because I did raise a concern yesterday that this could impact the recovery of tourism, but further and proper analysis suggests it shouldn't, because this does not apply to the next financial year. This applies to the financial year further down. So one would anticipate and expect that, well, we might still be going through a few niggles come 2027, 2028. The tourism industry itself should be back on strong footing come that financial year, and should be better able to absorb that additional 5% GCT rate. Could it impact the arrivals to the island because things are more expensive? In my historical analysis, I understand that this same concern was raised when the tax was added to each individual ticket for stopover arrivals, that it could harm the tourism product, that it could discourage individuals coming to Jamaica by making our price a little bit more expensive. But that fear to this date has not been borne out. So I cannot imagine that a slight 5% point increase in the GCT rate will have any devastating impact on the industry. Will it have an impact? Well, only time will tell. And the last major revenue measure, which is one I think most Jamaicans at this point have grown accustomed to, is the continued $11.4 billion drawdown from the National Housing Trust to the central government. I understand that the opposition spokesperson on housing, that is Floyd Morris, has raised some issue, considering that the PNP has been on the bandwagon to suggest that no, this drawdown must end and the NHT must be returned to its original mandate. But when it comes to matters of tapping revenue sources, what I have found is that once you open that Pandora's box, it's hard to close it. And I point to 2 things in just the recent parliamentary sessions. And that is this matter of the NHT drawdown and the asset tax. To Jamaicans who are not au fait, both of these measures happened under the PNP's administration. Both of these measures considered temporary in order to respond to the concerns of the economic fallout of the 2008-2012 era. And as you can imagine, both of these measures continue to this day because the country still not quite out of the woods in terms of its fiscal support. And as a result, the government has essentially programmed in these measures, and it is going to be very difficult to wean the economy and to wean the budget off of these measures. And I think there has to be that understanding. But at the very least, we know that the government has given the commitment that the asset tax will be abolished once they believe the fiscal space is there. And for the NHT drawdown, we now have a definitive date of its end, and that has been set to 2031. So both these measures will come to an end, but it does raise the concern, and I think many people should understand this. When somebody tells you that a tax measure is going to be temporary, you really should question that, because there is very little likelihood that any measure once put in place is going to be that easily withdrawn unless the country finds itself in a major largesse in terms of growth or finds alternative revenues to make up that fallout. So whenever someone tells you, oh, this tax is going to be temporary, it's going to go away eventually, question that sentiment. Question it very much so. And just finally, listeners, the matter of the public sector wage bill. It's not in the line item of the budget, but it has to be brought up and it has to be discussed. It needs to be capped. We're going through a difficult time. And as I said earlier, everybody has to pay their way forward now. And it cannot be a case where we expect the government to borrow billions and billions of dollars for our grandsons and our granddaughters and their grandsons and granddaughters to pay it off, as we've done in the past. That has to be a sentiment of the past as well. Going forward, we have to pay our way. And in order to pay our way, the public sector has to pay its way as well. The public sector at this point consumes over 60% of government revenue. That's 60% of every tax dollar that the government earns. It goes directly to the public sector and paying their wages. At some point, without the added productivity that we keep touting, without the growth numbers that would be needed to support that kind of increasing cost, it needs to be capped at some point. So that is where I'm going to leave it today, listeners.